The crack of a rifle shot silenced the bustling crowd gathered in Shoshone, Idaho, on that scorching July afternoon in 1878. The sound echoed through the main street, bouncing off the weathered facades of the saloon and general store, a stark reminder that in this unforgiving territory, life and death danced together like tumbleweeds in the wind. "Next up for auction," bellowed Orville Preston, the town's auctioneer, wiping beads of sweat from his brow with a handkerchief that had long since lost its original color. "Property of the late Samuel Gardner." He gestured toward a young woman standing on the wooden platform beside him, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her chin held high despite the circumstances that had brought her to this humiliating position. Faith Gardner stood motionless, her honey-brown hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders, framing a face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Her blue dress, once fine but now tattered at the hem, fluttered in the hot breeze. At 22, she had already endured more suffering than most faced in a lifetime. The recent death of her father had left her with nothing but debts, and the bank had seized everything, even her, claiming her father had signed papers putting her up as collateral for his final desperate loan. The crowd murmured, a mixture of pity and cruel curiosity in their eyes. Some of the men leered openly, while others looked away in discomfort. Women clutched their husbands' arms, whispering behind gloved hands. "Bidding starts at $50 for the Gardner girl," Preston announced, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Good for housekeeping, cooking, and whatever else a man might need." He winked, drawing uncomfortable laughter from some of the men. No hands went up. Preston cleared his throat. $40 then, still no response. 30, the silence grew heavier. "What's wrong with you all?" Preston growled. $20 for the girl, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. "Everyone knows Samuel Gardner was a thief and a cheat." "Who's to say the daughter ain't the same?" Another voice joined in. "I heard she's sickly, won't last a winter. She's probably cursed, bringing bad luck to that family." Preston's face reddened with frustration. $10, surely she's worth $10 to someone. Faith stood taller, even as shame burned through her. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She'd watched her mother die of consumption 3 years prior, nursed her father through his final days despite his gambling and drinking that had cost them everything. She had endured, and she would continue to endure. From the edge of the crowd, a tall figure moved forward, the sun at his back casting him in shadow. As he approached the auction platform, the crowd parted like water around a stone. Quentin Mason was not a man people stood in the way of, not in Shoshone or anywhere else in Idaho territory. He stopped just before the platform, removing his hat to reveal sun-bleached blonde hair and piercing green eyes set in a face weathered by years under the open sky. At 30, Quentin had already built himself a reputation as one of the finest horsemen and cattle drivers in the territory. His ranch, the Broken Arrow, lay 10 miles outside of town, employing a dozen men and spanning several thousand acres. "This is ridiculous, Preston," Quentin said, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the now silent crowd. "You can't auction off a person." "The bank holds the papers, Mason," Preston replied defensively. "I'm just doing my job. Her father put her up as collateral." "That's not legal and you know it," Quentin countered, his hand resting casually near the revolver on his hip. Preston's laugh was short and bitter. "Legal out here. The bank wants its money. If you're so concerned about what's legal, perhaps you should bid." "What's she worth then?" Quentin demanded. Preston looked Faith up and down with a dismissive sneer. "Well, it seems no one's interested. She's worth nothing." Quentin's eyes met Faith's for the first time. In that moment, Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding of what it meant to stand alone in this harsh world. "Then she's worth everything to me," Quentin said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. He tossed a small leather pouch onto the platform. "There's $100, more than enough to cover whatever Gardner owed." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Preston snatched up the pouch, weighing it in his hand with disbelief. "Sold," he declared, too stunned to argue. "The Gardner girl goes to Quentin Mason." Faith's heart hammered in her chest as Quentin mounted the steps to the platform. He drew a knife from his belt, and for a terrifying moment, she wondered if she had just exchanged one nightmare for another. But he merely cut the ropes binding her wrists, careful not to nick her skin. "You don't own me," she whispered fiercely, rubbing her chafed wrists. "No, I don't," he agreed, replacing his hat. "You're free to go wherever you please, but if you've nowhere to go, I'm offering you honest work at my ranch. As a housekeeper," he added quickly. "Nothing more." Faith studied him, searching for deceit in his eyes but finding none. "Why would you help me?" Quentin glanced around at the townspeople who were already beginning to disperse, their entertainment concluded. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be sold off by people who should have protected you." Before she could question him further, he offered his hand. "Do you accept my offer of employment, Miss Gardner? I promise you'll be treated with respect." Faith hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I accept, Mr. Mason, and I warn you I'll work hard, but I won't be mistreated." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'd expect nothing less." As they walked away from the auction platform, Faith felt the weight of stares on her back, but held her head high. She had no idea what awaited her at the Broken Arrow Ranch, but it had to be better than the fate she'd narrowly escaped. Little did she know that this day, the day she was deemed worthless by her community, would be the first day of a journey that would test every fiber of her being and ultimately lead to a love neither she nor Quentin could have imagined possible. The journey to the Broken Arrow Ranch was largely silent. Quentin had helped Faith onto his horse, mounting behind her with a respectful distance between them. The rhythmic clip-clop of hooves against the hardened earth was oddly soothing after the chaos of the auction. As they crested a hill, Quentin pulled the horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, his deep voice close to her ear. "Broken Arrow." Faith gazed down at the sprawling ranch nestled in a valley. A large two-story house stood proudly at the center, surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and pastures dotted with cattle. In the distance, the Sawtooth Mountains provided a magnificent backdrop against the clear blue sky. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "It wasn't always," Quentin replied. "When I bought it 6 years ago, it was barely standing. Every board, every nail, I put them there with these hands." There was unmistakable pride in his voice. They continued down the hill, and as they approached, Faith noticed several men pausing in their work to watch their arrival. A woman with silver-streaked black hair emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on an apron. "That's Mrs. Harrington," Quentin explained. "She's been cooking and keeping house for me since I started. She's a widow, lives in the small cabin behind the main house." When they reached the front of the house, Quentin dismounted first, then offered a hand to help Faith down. She accepted, conscious of the curious stares from the ranch hands who had gathered nearby. "Boys," Quentin addressed them, "this is Miss Gardner. She'll be helping Mrs. Harrington with the house. Treat her with the same respect you'd show your own mothers and sisters." His tone left no room for argument. The men nodded, a few tipping their hats before returning to their tasks. Mrs. Harrington approached, her sharp eyes taking in Faith's disheveled appearance. "About time you brought someone to help with this place," she said to Quentin. I'm not getting any younger, and these men make more mess than a herd of buffalo. Quentin smiled. Mrs. Harrington, this is Faith Gardner. Faith, this is Margaret Harrington, the finest cook in Idaho territory and the only person on this ranch who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being a fool. Which is often, Mrs. Harrington added with a snort, but her eyes were kind as she extended a hand to Faith. Come along, dear. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. You look like you've been through hell. Faith took the older woman's hand gratefully. Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. Call me Maggie, everyone does. Well, except him, she said, nodding toward Quentin. Too stubborn for his own good, that one. As Maggie led Faith toward the house, Quentin called out, Faith. When she turned, he added, Your room will be upstairs next to Mrs. Harrington's. I'll have your belongings brought up. Faith's face fell. I don't have any belongings, Mr. Mason. The bank took everything. Something flashed in his eyes, anger perhaps, though not directed at her. We'll figure something out, and it's Quentin, please. Faith nodded and continued into the house with Maggie, who immediately began chattering about the household routine and which of the ranch hands were troublemakers. The main floor of the house consisted of a spacious parlor, a dining room that could seat at least a dozen people, and a large kitchen that smelled of freshly baked bread and coffee. Upstairs, Maggie showed Faith to a modestly furnished but clean bedroom with a window overlooking the mountains. This will be your room, she said. Bathrooms down the hall. We've got running water. Quentin insisted on it when he rebuilt the place. Faith ran her hand over the quilt covering the bed. It's lovely. It's yours now, Maggie said firmly. Now let's find you some clothes. I might have some things that could fit you with a bit of taking in. An hour later, Faith had bathed and changed into a simple blue dress that Maggie had altered. Her wet hair was combed back, and for the first time in weeks, she felt human again. When she came downstairs, she found Quentin in the kitchen discussing something with his foreman, a grizzled man introduced as Hank Sullivan. Quentin stopped mid-sentence when he noticed her. You look rested, he said awkwardly. Thank you for the clothes and the room, Faith replied. I'll work hard to earn my keep. I don't doubt it, Quentin said. Hank, this is Miss Gardner. She'll be helping Mrs. Harrington around the house. Hank nodded respectfully. Madam, welcome to Broken Arrow. Hank's been with me since the beginning, Quentin explained. He keeps the men in line and the ranch running. When he lets me, Hank added with a good-natured grumble. Boss here likes to have his hand in everything. It's my ranch, Quentin replied, but there was no heat in his words, just the easy familiarity of men who had worked together for years. Maggie bustled back into the kitchen. Dinner's almost ready. Faith, would you help me set the table? The hands eat in the bunkhouse, but Quentin, Hank, and I take our meals in the dining room. You'll join us, of course. As Faith followed Maggie to gather plates and cutlery, she felt Quentin's eyes on her. When she glanced back, he quickly looked away, turning his attention back to his conversation with Hank. But in that brief moment, Faith had seen something in his expression, a softness, perhaps, that belied his rugged exterior. That night, after a hearty meal during which Hank regaled them with tales of the early days of the ranch, Faith lay in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside. The events of the day washed over her, the humiliation of the auction, the unexpected rescue, and now this strange new life that had been thrust upon her. She still didn't understand why Quentin Mason, a man she'd never met before today, had stepped forward to save her from a fate too terrible to contemplate. Then she's worth everything to me, he had said. The words echoed in her mind as she drifted off to sleep, wondering what tomorrow would bring at the Broken Arrow Ranch. Faith quickly settled into the rhythm of life at the Broken Arrow. She rose at dawn each day to help Maggie prepare breakfast for Quentin and the ranch hands. The work was hard but satisfying: cleaning, cooking, mending clothes, tending to the vegetable garden, and occasionally helping with the chickens and other small livestock kept near the house. During her first week, Quentin remained something of a mystery. He was often gone before sunrise, returning after sunset, covered in dust and exhaustion. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite but distant, as though uncertain how to interact with her. On her 8th day at the ranch, Faith was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she noticed Quentin in one of the corrals, working with a magnificent black stallion. The horse was wild-eyed and nervous, rearing and bucking as Quentin attempted to approach it. Forgetting her chores, Faith moved closer, watching in fascination. Quentin spoke in low, soothing tones to the horse, his movements slow and deliberate. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before: patient, gentle, coaxing rather than commanding. "That's Thunder," came Hank's voice beside her, making her jump. "Brought him in from the mountains last month. Wild as they come, but the boss sees something in him." "He's beautiful," Faith said, watching as the stallion gradually allowed Quentin to touch his neck. "He is that," Hank agreed. "Boss has a way with the broken ones. Says they just need patience and a chance to trust again." Faith pondered those words as she returned to her laundry. Later that afternoon, as she was preparing vegetables for dinner, Quentin entered the kitchen, his shirt soaked with sweat, dust streaking his face. "I saw you with that black horse earlier," Faith said, surprising herself with her boldness. "He seems to be warming up to you." Quentin paused, reaching for a cup to pour himself some water. "Thunder. He's still deciding if I'm friend or foe. Can't blame him, he's known nothing but the wild until now." "Why tame him then? Why not let him stay wild?" Quentin considered her question as he drank. "Some horses are meant for more than just surviving in the mountains. Thunder has heart. He could be something special with the right guidance." He set down his cup. "Besides, he was injured when we found him. Wouldn't have lasted the winter." "So you saved him," Faith said softly. "I gave him a chance," Quentin corrected. "The rest is up to him." He met her eyes briefly before looking away. "Like I gave you a chance." The comparison wasn't lost on Faith. "And am I still deciding if you're friend or foe, Mr. Mason?" A rare smile touched his lips. "I believe I asked you to call me Quentin." "Quentin," she amended, feeling a strange flutter in her chest at the informality. "As for friend or foe, that's for you to decide," he said. "But I hope you know I meant what I said. You're not property here. You're earning your keep, same as anyone else." Faith nodded, turning back to the carrots she was slicing. "Thank you for everything." Quentin lingered a moment longer than necessary before clearing his throat. "I should clean up before dinner." He headed for the door but paused in the doorway. "Faith, if you're interested in the horses, you're welcome to come to the corrals anytime. Might do Thunder good to have another gentle presence around." After he left, Faith realized she was smiling. It was the longest conversation they'd had since her arrival, and for the first time, she felt she'd glimpsed the real Quentin Mason beneath the stoic rancher exterior. The next morning, Faith woke before dawn and finished her early chores quickly. With Maggie's blessing, she made her way to the corrals where she found Quentin already at work with Thunder. "Morning," he called when he spotted her. "Come on in, but move slowly." Faith carefully entered the corral, keeping her movements deliberate as she'd seen Quentin do. Thunder's ears flicked back and forth, his dark eyes watching her warily. "He's not used to women," Quentin explained. "Speak to him so he gets used to your voice." "What do I say to a horse?" Faith asked. Quentin shrugged. "Anything. Read him poetry for all he cares. It's the tone that matters." So Faith began to talk, telling Thunder about her morning chores and commenting on the beautiful sunrise. Gradually, the horse's posture relaxed, though he maintained a safe distance. "He likes you," Quentin observed, sounding impressed. How can you tell? His ears. See how they're pointed toward you. He's listening. Quentin handed her an apple. Hold this flat on your palm. Don't approach him, let him come to you if he wants. Faith stood still, arm extended with the apple resting on her open palm. Thunder snorted, pawing at the ground nervously. Then, to her surprise, he took a tentative step forward, then another, until his soft muzzle tickled her hand as he took the apple. Well, I'll be damned, Quentin said softly. Took me 3 days to get him to take food from my hand. Faith couldn't suppress her delighted laugh as Thunder crunched the apple. He's just hungry. No, Quentin said, watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. He trusts you. That's rare. They fell into a routine after that. Each morning, Faith would join Quentin at the corrals for an hour before returning to her household duties. Over the weeks that followed, Thunder's trust grew, and so too did a tentative friendship between Faith and Quentin. She learned that he had come to Idaho territory as a boy of 14, working cattle drives and saving every penny until he could buy his own land. The Broken Arrow was the culmination of a dream that had sustained him through years of hardship. In turn, Faith shared stories of her own childhood happier times before her mother's illness and her father's descent into gambling and drink. She told Quentin about her love of books, how she'd had to sell her small collection to buy medicine for her father. One evening in late August, as Faith sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Quentin joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to her and settled into the chair beside her. Maggie tells me tomorrow's your birthday, he said. Faith looked at him in surprise. Yes, I'll be 23. How did Maggie know? She knows everything, Quentin said with a chuckle. I've stopped questioning it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching the stars appear one by one in the deepening twilight. I have something for you, Quentin said suddenly. Wait here. He disappeared into the house, returning a few minutes later with a package wrapped in brown paper. It's not much, he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous as he handed it to her. Faith carefully unwrapped the package to find 3 books, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, a novel by Jane Austen, and a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. She ran her fingers over the leather bindings, speechless with emotion. Maggie mentioned you sold your books, Quentin explained, misinterpreting her silence. If you don't like these, they're perfect, Faith interrupted, looking up at him with shining eyes. Truly perfect. Thank you, Quentin. Relief washed over his face. Happy birthday, Faith. That night, as Faith read by lamplight in her room, she realized with a start that she was happy at the Broken Arrow. The ranch had become more than just a refuge, it had become home. And Quentin was becoming something more than just her employer. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. After all, what future could there be between a penniless orphan and a successful rancher? She closed her book, forcing the foolish notion from her mind. Better to be grateful for what she had than to yearn for what could never be. Little did she know that in his own room down the hall, Quentin Mason was having similar thoughts about the woman who had brought an unexpected light into his carefully ordered life. Autumn arrived in a blaze of color, transforming the landscape around the Broken Arrow Ranch. The aspens turned golden, their leaves quivering in the cool breezes that swept down from the mountains. The days grew shorter, and the ranch hands worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming winter. Faith had been at the ranch for nearly 3 months now, and she had blossomed under the care and respect she received there. Her cheeks had filled out from regular meals, and her skin had taken on a healthy glow from work in the fresh air. Even her hair seemed more vibrant, cascading down her back in thick waves when she let it loose in the evenings. The changes weren't just physical. She moved with a new confidence, spoke her mind freely, and had developed an easy rapport with the ranch hands, who treated her with a protective respect that bordered on brotherly affection. Even gruff old Hank had taken to bringing her wildflowers he found during his rides around the property. But it was her relationship with Quentin that had undergone the most significant transformation. The awkward silences and cautious interactions had given way to comfortable companionship, and increasingly, moments charged with an unspoken awareness that neither seemed ready to acknowledge. On a crisp October morning, Faith was in the kitchen kneading dough for the day's bread when Quentin appeared in the doorway, dressed for riding. "I'm heading into town for supplies," he said, adjusting his hat. "Thought you might want to come along. You haven't left the ranch since you arrived." Faith wiped her hands on her apron, trying to hide her excitement at the prospect. "I'd like that, if Maggie can spare me." "Already cleared it with her," Quentin replied with a smile. "She said to tell you she's not so decrepit she can't manage one day without you." An hour later, they were in Quentin's wagon, rolling down the road toward Shoshone. Faith wore a green dress that Maggie had sewn for her, with a matching bonnet to protect her face from the sun. Beside her, Quentin handled the reins with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. "Nervous about going back?" he asked, glancing at her. Faith considered the question. "A little," she admitted. "Last time I was there wasn't exactly pleasant." Quentin's jaw tightened at the reminder. "No one will disrespect you today, not while I'm with you." The conviction in his voice warmed her more than the woolen shawl around her shoulders. "I know." As they approached Shoshone, Faith felt a flutter of anxiety. The town looked much as it had the day of the auction, though the streets were busier now, with wagons and horses tied outside the various establishments. Quentin pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. "We'll get the supplies first, then maybe stop for lunch at the hotel restaurant if you're amenable." "That sounds lovely," Faith said, accepting his hand as he helped her down from the wagon. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the general store. Mr. Peterson, the proprietor, looked up from where he was helping another customer, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Mr. Mason," he greeted, then hesitated before adding, "Miss Gardner. Welcome." Faith nodded politely, acutely aware of the curious stares from the other patrons. Quentin placed a reassuring hand at the small of her back, guiding her toward the shelves. "We need flour, sugar, coffee, and whatever else is on Maggie's list," he said, handing Faith a piece of paper. "Why don't you start gathering things while I talk to Peterson about those new harnesses?" Faith moved through the store, selecting items from Maggie's list. She was examining different spools of thread when she became aware of whispers nearby. Two women stood at the end of the aisle, making little effort to hide their gossip. "Living in sin, I'm sure of it," one was saying. "Why else would he have bought her at that auction? Martha says she has her own room, but who knows what happens after dark," the other replied. "Always the quiet ones you have to watch." Faith's hands trembled as she placed the spools of thread in her basket. She had known there would be talk, but hearing it so baldly stated made her stomach clench with shame and anger. "Excuse me," she said, turning to face the women directly. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about me." The women had the grace to look embarrassed at being caught, but neither apologized. "Mr. Mason offered me employment when no one else would help me," Faith continued, keeping her voice steady. "He and Mrs. Harrington have treated me with nothing but respect. If you're so concerned about propriety, perhaps you should direct your energy toward the men who thought it appropriate to auction off a woman in the first place." Before either woman could respond, Quentin appeared at Faith's side. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Faith and the gossiping women. Perfectly fine, Faith assured him, though her heart was racing. I was just explaining to these ladies that I'm the housekeeper at Broken Arrow, working alongside Mrs. Harrington. Understanding dawned in Quentin's eyes. He nodded curtly to the women. Ladies, I trust you'll remember that Miss Gardner is under my protection, and any insult to her character is an insult to mine. The implied threat in his tone was unmistakable. The women murmured apologies and hurried away, leaving Faith and Quentin alone in the aisle. I'm sorry about that, Quentin said quietly. People will talk. It's not your fault, Faith replied, and I can defend myself. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. So I noticed. You handled that with more grace than they deserved. They completed their shopping and loaded the supplies into the wagon. As promised, Quentin took Faith to the hotel restaurant for lunch. The dining room fell momentarily silent when they entered, but conversations quickly resumed, albeit with furtive glances in their direction. They were halfway through their meal when Orville Preston, the auctioneer from that fateful day, approached their table. Faith tensed, but Quentin's expression remained neutral. Mr. Mason, Miss Gardner, Preston said, hat in hand. I hope I'm not interrupting your meal. You are, Quentin replied bluntly. What do you want, Preston? The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. I wanted to apologize to Miss Gardner for my part in what happened. It wasn't right, and I've lost sleep over it. Faith studied the man's face, searching for sincerity. Did you know it wasn't legal? She asked. Preston had the decency to look ashamed. I suspected as much, but the bank was insistent. Still, that's no excuse. I should have refused. No, you should have, Faith agreed. But thank you for the apology. Preston nodded, glancing between them. You both look well. I'm glad things worked out. He hesitated before adding, there's a harvest dance at the town hall next weekend. The whole community will be there. You'd both be welcome. After Preston left, Quentin looked at Faith questioningly. What do you think? Would you like to attend the dance? Faith was surprised by the offer. You'd want to go, not particularly, he admitted with a wry smile. But it might be good for you to socialize beyond the ranch, and it would put some of these rumors to rest if we appeared in public at a respectable event. Then yes, Faith decided, I'd like to go. The week leading up to the harvest dance was filled with anticipation. Maggie insisted on making Faith a new dress for the occasion, a lovely creation of deep blue satin that complemented her eyes and fair complexion. You'll be the belle of the ball, Maggie declared as she made final adjustments to the bodice. Every young buck in the county will be falling over himself to dance with you. Faith laughed, though her thoughts were only of dancing with one particular man. I doubt that very much. Maggie gave her a knowing look. Don't sell yourself short, girl, and don't think I haven't noticed how the boss looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Faith's cheeks burned. Maggie, it's not like that. He's my employer. HMPH, was Maggie's only response, but her eyes twinkled with mischief as she continued her sewing. On the night of the dance, Faith stood before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. The blue dress fit perfectly, accentuating her slender waist and the gentle curves of her figure. Maggie had helped her arrange her hair in an elegant updo, with a few soft tendrils framing her face. When she descended the stairs, Quentin was waiting in the foyer, dressed in his best suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. He stared at her, momentarily speechless. You look beautiful, he finally said, his voice slightly hoarse. Thank you, Faith replied, equally affected by his transformation from rugged rancher to dashing gentleman. You look very handsome yourself. The ride to town was charged with a new awareness between them. Faith was conscious of every accidental brush of their arms, every glance exchanged in the soft glow of the lantern hanging from the wagon. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves, pumpkins, and bundles of wheat. A small band played lively tunes, and couples whirled around the dance floor. When Faith and Quentin entered, there was the same momentary pause in conversation she'd experienced at the restaurant. But this time it was followed by smiles and welcoming nods. Several of the town's leading citizens came to greet them, making a point of including Faith in their conversations. She realized that Quentin's position as one of the area's most successful ranchers afforded her a measure of social acceptance she might not otherwise have received. "May I have this dance?" Quentin asked as the band struck up a waltz. Faith placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, I'm not very practiced." "Neither am I," he admitted, leading her onto the floor. "We'll muddle through together." His hand at her waist was warm and steady as they joined the other couples. After a few awkward starts, they found their rhythm, moving together as if they'd danced 100 times before. Faith was keenly aware of his nearness, the clean scent of his shaving soap, the way his eyes never left her face. "Everyone's watching us," she murmured. "Let them," Quentin replied. "I'm only looking at you." The simple declaration made her heart skip a beat. As the evening progressed, Faith danced with several other men, including Hank and some of the younger ranch hands who had come to town for the celebration. But it was the dances with Quentin that left her breathless and confused about her growing feelings for the man who had rescued her. Near midnight, as the festivities were winding down, Quentin suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. They walked to a quiet spot behind the town hall where a small garden offered privacy. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Quentin asked. "Very much," Faith replied. "Thank you for bringing me." "I think you've won over half the town tonight," he said with a smile. "Preston told me 3 different people scolded him for how he treated you at the auction." Faith laughed softly. "Progress, I suppose." They fell silent, standing close in the moonlight. Faith was acutely aware of Quentin watching her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Faith," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. "Yes," she prompted gently. "These past months, having you at Broken Arrow, it's changed things, changed me." He took a deep breath. "I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, wondering what you're doing if you're happy." Faith's pulse quickened. "I am happy. Happier than I've been in a very long time. I'm glad," he said, "but I'm also worried about what people say about your reputation." "My reputation?" Faith frowned. "I thought we addressed that by coming here tonight." Quentin shook his head. "It's not enough. As long as you're living under my roof as an employee, there will always be talk." A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night settled over Faith. Are you asking me to leave?" "No," Quentin said quickly, taking her hands in his. "God, no, I'm doing this all wrong." He took another deep breath. "What I'm trying to say very badly is that I care for you, Faith, more than an employer should care for his housekeeper. More than I've ever cared for anyone." Faith stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'm not offering you a position anymore," Quentin continued. "I'm offering you a partnership, a life together, if you'll have me." "Quentin," Faith whispered, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. "Are you proposing?" In answer, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold ring with a single perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," he said. "Faith Gardner, I know it hasn't been very long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Will you marry me?" Faith looked into his eyes, seeing all the hope and vulnerability he usually kept hidden behind his stoic exterior. In that moment, She knew with absolute certainty that this man, this good, honorable man who had declared her worth everything to him when the rest of the world saw nothing, was the one she wanted to spend her life with. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, I will marry you, Quentin Mason." Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as Faith responded with all the emotion she'd been holding back for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Faith." "And I love you," she replied, marveling at how right the words felt, how naturally they came. They returned to the dance with their hands intertwined, and the news of their engagement spreading quickly through the hall. What had begun as whispers of scandal transformed into congratulations and well wishes. Even the women who had gossiped about Faith in the general store came to offer their felicitations, though Faith noted with some amusement that their smiles seemed rather fixed. As they drove back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Faith felt as though her heart might overflow with happiness. The journey that had begun on that terrible day at the auction had led her here, to this man and this love that seemed almost miraculous in its unlikelihood. "What are you thinking?" Quentin asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Faith smiled, looking down at the ring glinting in the moonlight. "I'm thinking about worth. How strange it is that the day you found me, I was deemed worthless by everyone else." Quentin's hand found hers, his grip warm and reassuring. "They were wrong. You're worth everything to me, Faith." Everything and more. News of the engagement between Quentin Mason and Faith Gardner spread through Shoshone and the surrounding countryside like wildfire. Most reactions were positive. Quentin was well respected, and those who had gotten to know Faith recognized her intelligence, kindness, and strength of character. There were some, of course, who raised eyebrows at the speed of the courtship and the circumstances of their meeting, but such voices were increasingly in the minority. At the ranch, the announcement was met with enthusiastic approval. Maggie claimed she'd known all along and had been wondering when Quentin would get his head out of the clouds and do something about it. Hank organized an impromptu celebration with the ranch hands, complete with a makeshift band using washboards and combs, that left everyone laughing and a bit tipsy from the homebrew someone had smuggled in. Faith and Quentin decided on a Christmas wedding, giving them 2 months to prepare. In the meantime, Faith moved into one of the guest rooms in a different wing of the house to maintain propriety, though the arrangement seemed somewhat comical given that they were the only ones concerned about such formalities. November brought the first snows and a flurry of wedding preparations. Faith threw herself into the planning with Maggie's help, while also continuing her regular duties at the ranch. Quentin, meanwhile, worked with renewed vigor, determined that their first winter as husband and wife would be comfortable and secure. One afternoon, as Faith was reviewing fabric samples for her wedding dress, a commotion outside drew her attention. Looking out the window, she saw a wagon approaching, accompanied by 2 riders. As it drew closer, she recognized Hank as one of the riders, but the wagon and the other horsemen were unfamiliar. She hurried downstairs and out onto the porch just as the wagon pulled up to the house. In the back of the wagon lay a man, his face pale, a bloodied bandage wrapped around his thigh. "Faith," Hank called, dismounting quickly. "Where's the boss?" "Checking the north pasture with some of the men," she replied, already moving toward the injured man. "What happened?" "Stage robbery," Hank explained grimly. "This here's Joe Blackburn, the driver. He took a bullet trying to protect the passengers. We found him on our way back from checking fence lines." The other rider, a young man Faith didn't recognize, added, The doc's out delivering a baby in Eagle Creek. Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest. Faith assessed the situation quickly. Bring him inside. We'll put him in the downstairs guest room. With Hank and the other man's help, they carried Joe into the house and laid him on the bed. Faith sent the young rider to find Quentin while she and Hank removed Joe's boots and cut away his blood-soaked pants leg to better see the wound. Bullet went clean through, Hank observed. That's something, at least. Faith examined the injury with a critical eye. The bleeding's mostly stopped, but it needs proper cleaning and stitching. She looked up at Hank. I've done this before with my father. I can help him if you'll assist me. Hank nodded without hesitation. Just tell me what you need. Faith quickly gathered supplies: hot water, clean cloths, whiskey for disinfecting, a needle and thread, and some of Maggie's herbal poultices. Joe was semi-conscious, groaning in pain as they cleaned the wound. This will hurt, Faith warned him, preparing to pour whiskey over the injury. Hank, hold him steady. Joe's scream when the alcohol hit his wound was heartbreaking, but Faith worked methodically, focusing on the task rather than the man's pain. Her hands were steady as she stitched first the exit wound on the front of his thigh, then the larger entry wound on the back. She was applying Maggie's poultice to the stitched wounds when Quentin burst into the room, his face taut with concern. Tom found me at the north pasture, he said, taking in the scene. What happened? Hank explained about finding Joe on the road, while Faith continued her work, wrapping clean bandages around the man's leg. You've done this before, Quentin observed, watching her efficient movements. Faith nodded, not looking up. My father was shot twice during his more desperate gambling days. I learned out of necessity. Once Joe was bandaged and resting more comfortably, Faith finally straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her back from bending over for so long. You should rest, Quentin said, placing a hand on her shoulder. I'll sit with him for a while. Faith shook her head. I need to watch for fever. The first few hours are critical. Quentin studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then I'll stay with you. They spent the night taking turns monitoring Joe, changing his bandages, and coaxing water and broth between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. By morning, Faith was exhausted but relieved to find that Joe's skin was cool to the touch, no sign of the fever that often followed such injuries. You saved his life, Quentin told her as they shared a pot of coffee in the kitchen while Maggie sat with Joe. If you hadn't been here. Faith shrugged, too tired for false modesty. He was lucky. The bullet missed the major blood vessels, but he'll need several weeks of rest before he can travel. He'll stay here as long as necessary, Quentin decided. I've sent word to his employers at the stage company. Later that day, when the doctor finally arrived, he examined Joe's wound and declared that Faith's treatment had been exactly what he would have done himself. You've got a natural gift for healing, Miss Gardner, he said. If you ever tire of being a rancher's wife, I could use an assistant. Faith laughed off the suggestion, but later, as she and Quentin walked together in the crisp evening air, she found herself considering it. What if I did help the doctor sometimes? She asked. Not as an assistant, but perhaps when he's overextended or for emergencies here at the ranch. Quentin took her hand, his thumb gently caressing her engagement ring. I think it's a fine idea. Your skills are too valuable to go unused. Faith looked at him in surprise. You wouldn't mind having a wife who sometimes acts as a doctor, mind? Quentin shook his head, a smile playing at his lips. Faith, I fell in love with you precisely because you're the kind of woman who would stay up all night to save a stranger's life. I would never ask you to be less than who you are. His words washed over her like a blessing. All her life, Faith had been told explicitly or implicitly that her worth lay in her usefulness to others, in her compliance, in fitting herself into the narrow space society had carved out for women. Here was a man offering her partnership instead of ownership, encouraging her to expand into her full potential rather than contract to fit his expectations. "Have I told you today that I love you?" she asked, leaning into him. "Not since breakfast," he replied, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Then I've been remiss," Faith said, rising on tiptoes to press a kiss to his lips. "I love you, Quentin Mason." He deepened the kiss, pulling her closer, his voice rough when they finally broke apart. "Christmas can't come soon enough," Faith agreed wholeheartedly. The weeks leading up to Christmas flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Joe Blackburn recovered steadily under Faith's care, eventually becoming strong enough to join the household for meals. He was a natural storyteller, regaling them with tales of his adventures as a stage driver and the colorful characters he'd encountered. Faith's wedding dress was completed a creation of ivory satin and lace that Maggie declared would make Quentin forget his own name when he sees you in it. The town's small church was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and invitations were sent to friends and neighbors throughout the county. 2 days before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm descended on the region, blanketing the ranch in white and raising concerns about whether guests would be able to travel for the wedding. Faith found Quentin in the barn that evening, checking on the horses and making sure everything was secure against the worsening weather. "The Sullivans sent word they won't make it from Boys," she told him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "And the Petersons are doubtful." Quentin nodded, unsurprised. "We may have a smaller wedding than planned." "Does that bother you?" Faith asked, watching his face. He turned to her, his expression soft in the lantern light. "All that matters is that you'll be there. And Reverend Thompson, I suppose, or it won't be official." He took her hands in his. "But if you're disappointed, I'm not," Faith assured him. "As long as we're married at the end of the day, I don't care if it's in front of 2 people or 200. Quentin pulled her into his arms, his chest rumbling with quiet laughter. "Have I mentioned lately that you're perfect?" "Not perfect," Faith corrected, smiling up at him. "Just perfect for you." On Christmas Eve morning, Faith awoke to brilliant sunshine. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine winter wonderland that sparkled under the clear blue sky. It was, she thought, a perfect day for a wedding. Despite the snow, more guests managed to arrive than they had expected. The church was nearly full when Faith, on Joe Blackburn's arm, her request, as he had become something of a father figure during his convalescence, walked down the aisle toward Quentin. He stood tall and proud at the altar, his eyes never leaving hers as she approached. The love in his gaze made her feel beautiful, cherished, treasured beyond measure. When Joe placed her hand in Quentin's, the older man's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Take care of her, son," Joe said. "She's 1 in a million." "I know," Quentin replied, squeezing Faith's hand gently. The ceremony was simple but moving. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin's kiss was both tender and full of promise, drawing good-natured cheers from their guests. The celebration continued at the Broken Arrow, where tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by Maggie and the women of the community. There was music and dancing, laughter, and a few happy tears. As the afternoon light began to fade, Faith found herself standing by the window, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Quentin came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Mason?" Her new name sent a thrill through her. "I'm thinking about that day in Shoshone," she said. "How close I came to a very different life if you hadn't been there." "But I was," he said, turning her to face him. "And you're here now where you belong." "Where I belong," Faith repeated, the words filling her with contentment. This was home, this man, this house, this life they would build together. As their guests began to depart, calling out final congratulations and well wishes, Faith and Quentin stood on the porch, arms around each other, watching the sleighs and wagons disappear down the snow-covered lane. "Shall we go inside, wife?" Quentin asked, his voice low and intimate in her ear. Faith turned in his embrace, her eyes reflecting all the love and desire she felt for this man who had seen her worth when no one else had. "Yes, husband. Let's go home." That night, as snow began to fall once more outside their window, Faith and Quentin discovered a deeper intimacy, a physical expression of the love and trust that had grown between them over the past months. In each other's arms, they found a belonging neither had known was possible, a completion that felt like coming home after a long journey. Spring came early to the Broken Arrow that year, as if nature itself was celebrating the new life and love that had taken root there. Faith blossomed in her role as Quentin's wife and partner, taking on responsibilities that ranged from keeping the ranch's books to assisting Dr. Thompson when needed. Word of her skill with injuries and illnesses spread, and it wasn't uncommon for ranch hands from neighboring properties to show up at the Broken Arrow when they needed medical attention. Quentin watched his wife's growth with pride and something akin to awe. They had occasional disagreements. Both were strong-willed individuals with firm opinions, but they always found their way back to each other, their bond strengthening with each challenge faced and overcome together. In late April, as wildflowers carpeted the meadows and new calves wobbled beside their mothers in the pastures, Faith received a letter that left her pale and shaken. Quentin found her in the garden, the open letter clutched in her trembling hands. "Faith, what's wrong?" She looked up, her eyes troubled. "It's from a lawyer in San Francisco. My father had a partner there I never knew about. Apparently, he's been trying to find me since father died." Quentin took the letter, scanning its contents quickly. "He says your father owned a share in a silver mine, that the mine has started producing and your father's share is worth a considerable sum." Faith nodded, still stunned. "According to this, I'm now a wealthy woman in my own right. It doesn't seem real." "You want to go to San Francisco?" Quentin asked, his expression carefully neutral. "To meet this partner and verify the claim." Faith studied his face, reading the unspoken fear there. "No," she said firmly. "We can handle this through correspondence. I have no desire to leave the Broken Arrow." She took his hand, pressing it to her still flat stomach. "Especially not now." It took a moment for her meaning to register. When it did, Quentin's face transformed with wonder. "Faith, are you saying?" "Dr. Thompson confirmed it yesterday," she said, her smile radiant. "We're going to have a baby, Quentin, in November." He whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Is this all right? Should I not have?" Faith laughed, cutting off his worry with a kiss. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass, but your concern is very sweet." As summer turned to autumn, Faith's body changed to accommodate the new life growing within her. Quentin was attentive to the point of hovering, much to Maggie's amusement and Faith's fond exasperation. Every kick, every milestone was celebrated, the entire ranch seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of the new arrival. November brought early snows again, and with them, the birth of Quincy William Mason, a healthy baby boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's determination. The delivery was long and difficult, but Faith emerged from it tired, triumphant, and more in love than ever as she watched Quentin hold their son for the first time. "He's perfect," Quentin whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that seemed suddenly too large, too rough for such a delicate task. "Of course he is," Faith replied with a tired smile. "He's ours." The years that followed brought more children, Alina Margaret 2 years later, and twins Robert James and Rebecca Jane 2 years after that. The Broken Arrow prospered and expanded, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Faith's inheritance from the silver mine was invested wisely, providing additional security for their growing family and allowing them to support various community initiatives, including a small hospital in Shoshone where Faith occasionally assisted. On a warm summer evening in 1888, 10 years after they first met, Faith and Quentin sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Quincy, now almost 10, was showing his younger siblings how to lasso a fence post, his face serious with concentration. "He reminds me of you," Faith observed, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "So determined to get everything just right." Quentin chuckled, his arm tightening around her waist. "And Ellie has your spirit. Did you see her stand up to that boy who was teasing Becky at the picnic last week?" Fierce as a mother bear, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, the peace of the evening settling around them like a familiar blanket. "You ever think about that day?" Quentin asked suddenly. "At the auction," Faith nodded. "Sometimes. Less often now than I used to." "Do you regret any of it?" She turned to look at him, this man who had been her salvation, her partner, her love for a decade now. Lines had formed at the corners of his eyes and streaks of silver had appeared in his hair, but to Faith, he was more handsome than ever. "Not a single moment," she said with absolute certainty. "How could I regret the path that led me here? To you, to our children, to this life we've built." Quentin kissed her then, a tender affirmation of the love that had only deepened with the passage of time. "You know," he said when they broke apart, "I meant what I said that day. You're worth everything to me, Faith. Everything and more." Faith smiled, resting her head on his shoulder as they turned their attention back to their children's play. "And you to me, Quentin. You to me." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Faith thought about worth, how it was not something that could be assigned by an auctioneer's gavel or the judgment of others. True worth was found in love freely given and received, in the family they had created, in the life they had built together against all odds. On that long-ago day in Shoshone, the auctioneer had declared her worthless. Quentin had seen differently. And in proving him right in finding her own value and strength, Faith had discovered a truth that sustained her through all the joys and challenges of the years that followed. That love, real love, sees worth where others see nothing. And that kind of love, once found, was truly worth everything.